If you've followed the news at all in the past few weeks, chances are that you've heard about the recall election that happened in California. And if you know about that, you've probably also heard the name Larry Elder a few times. Larry Elder is a conservative talk radio host and was a Republican candidate for the recall election. He's known for things such as being an avid Trump supporter, spreading the big lie, misogyny, transphobia, and being generally anti-science. So you know, he's the full Republican package. As I often watch right-wing channels to keep up to date with whatever bullshit they're spewing, YouTube seems to have put two and two together and thought it was a good idea to recommend me a video from 2016 by Dave Rubin, in which he interviewed Elder. He starts off by ranting for a few minutes about how the term African American makes him as one does, and as back then Rubin was still pretending to be a liberal, he brings up the idea that in the US, police might be more likely to use force against black persons, to which Elder responds by citing some statistics which supposedly debunk this idea. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'll go through what he says point by point. Here's the first clip.
I think you could probably find evidence that, in general, cops are more willing to shoot if the perpetrator is black than white.
What's your basis for saying that? Last year...
Well, look, I know a lot of people would say, look what's going on in Chicago.
I know what they would say. Yeah. I'm talking about what the facts are. 965 people were shot by cops last year and killed. 4% of them were white cops shooting unarmed blacks. In Chicago in 2011, 21 people were shot and killed by cops. In 2015, there were 7.
I'll start with the statistics he cites about Chicago because, I don't know where he got them. The one statistic I found regarding the number of police killings in Chicago in 2011 was from an article by the Better Government Association, where the link is broken and leads to a poker website. Thankfully, the original document has been archived and does give a number of fatal police shootings, but the number they mention is 23, not 21 like Larry said. In the 2015 document, the number is also different. They state that there were 8 fatal officer-involved shootings in Chicago that year, not 7. Now, this difference is likely because they also included police deaths in the total, while Elder was only referring to the number of people killed by police. Again, I just couldn't find the numbers he mentions anywhere, but I don't really think Elder was lying. Regardless, getting back to these statistics he cited, his point seems to be that killings by police are going down. And indeed, while in Chicago police killings seem to be going downwards, not every city in the US experienced this same trend. According to the Mapping Police Violence Project, which has been documenting police killings since 2013, while urban areas did see a decrease in police violence, suburban and rural areas saw an increase in that same time period. This trend is also clear when comparing Chicago with other cities. Of course, this data goes beyond the 2011 to 2015 span that Elder mentions. However, even if we look only at the period between 2013 to 2015, we see that the same pattern holds up. And if we look at the general trend over the past few years, we see that the total number of police killings has remained pretty much the same. So yeah, if Elder's point was that police killings are going down, well that might be true for Chicago, when we look to the entire country we see that police violence still remains as much of a problem as it's been in previous years. Next, let's go back to the first statement he made. The numbers Elder mentions seems to come from an investigation by the Washington Post published on the 26th of December 2015. As Elder said, in it they state that 965 people were fatally shot by police, of which less than 4% involved white police officers killing unarmed black men. The first thing that's worth mentioning here is that this article undercounted the number of police killings in that year. For one, another article published by the Washington Post on that same day puts the number at 990. Both of these estimates are incomplete, however, as they only include police killings from before they finished their respective investigations. The current Washington Post database on fatal police shootings instead puts the total number at 994. Other sources put the total even higher, at 1,102 or 1,146. These inconsistent numbers are a known problem, as even official sources often don't agree on the number of police killings. Since 2019, the FBI has been collecting data on police use of force, however less than half of law enforcement agencies actually participate. This is why we're never actually completely sure of the extent of the problem that is police violence. Many cases go unreported, or even when they are reported, we may not have the data necessary to assess racial disparities. But let's go back to the Washington Post article that Elder mentioned. Now, I don't know if he read this article specifically, or if an employee of his told him about these numbers, or even if he read the New York Post article on this investigation, which framed it as debunking the killer cop epidemic. But the conclusions of the original post are very different from Elder's. The authors very clearly conclude that people of color are more likely to be unjustly killed by police, stating on the 5th paragraph that, although black men make up only 6% of the US population, they account for 40% of the unarmed men shot to death by police this year, the Post's database shows. In the majority of cases in which police shot and killed a person who had attacked someone with a weapon or brandished a gun, the person who was shot was white. But a hugely disproportionate number, 3 in 5, of those killed after exhibiting less threatening behavior were black or Hispanic. Elder conveniently doesn't mention these numbers, instead presenting the Post's findings as though they prove that cops aren't biased against black persons, something which is already contradicted at the beginning of the article. They also point out that someone being armed does not necessarily justify them being killed. In many cases where someone had some kind of weapon, they were planning to harm themselves, not others. As they state in the article, the research also noted whether victims were mentally ill or experiencing an emotional crisis, a category which came to account for 1/4 of those killed. Officers fatally shot at least 243 people with mental health problems, 75 who were explicitly suicidal, and 168 for whom police or family members confirmed a history of mental illness. The analysis found that about 9 in 10 of the mentally troubled people were armed, usually with guns but also with knives or other sharp objects. But the analysis also found that most of them died at the hands of police officers who had not been trained to deal with the mentally ill. In most of those cases, police were called by a relative or a neighbor who was worried about a mentally fragile person's erratic behavior. Yvonne Motti of Alabama dialed 911 in March out of desperation, hoping police could help her brother, Shane Watkins, who suffered from schizophrenia. Instead, he wound up dead. A week after they killed my brother, there was an armed robbery, Motti said. That guy had a gun, and they arrested him without killing him. Why did they have to kill my brother, who only had a box cutter? I still don't understand. They also state that in 1/4 of instances, police shot the victim after pursuing them by foot or car. And don't get me wrong, running from police isn't a good thing, but maybe death isn't really a suitable punishment for trying to run away. In any case, the article outright contradicts the narrative that Elder is trying to push, concluding that yes, racial disparities in police killings are still a problem, among a variety of other issues. I think it's also worth noting that when looking for these statistics, I also came across an old article by the Chicago Tribune, which states that there were 107 police shootings in total in 2011 and 44 in 2015. These numbers are bigger than the aforementioned 23 and 8 police shootings because they include instances where the officer missed or in which the suspect was injured but not killed. I think it's important to point this out because a shooting doesn't need to end in death for it to be an example of excessive use of force. And as there are many more cases in which the person who was shot didn't die, focusing only on police killings like Elder does underrepresents the problem of police brutality. Let's continue on to the next clip.
In Chicago, which is a third black, a third white, and a third Hispanic, 70% of the homicides are black on black. About 40 per month, almost 500 per year last year in Chicago, and 75% of them are unsolved. Where is the Black Lives Matter on that? The idea that a racist white cop shooting unarmed black people is a peril to black people is BS. It's complete and total BS. And the reason for these so-called activists saying this is the assumption that racism remains a major problem in America. The media, CNN, especially MSNBC, runs down whenever a black cop shoots somebody, and it's some march on Washington. It's ridiculous. Black people, half the homicides in this country are committed by and against black people. Last year there were 14,000 homicides. I'm not talking about suicides. I'm talking about homicides. Half of them were black. 96% of them black on black of that 7,000. Where's the Black Lives Matter people on that?
Once again, I don't know where Elder got some of his numbers. This 50% of crime is committed by black people phrase is often touted as an approximation of the real statistic, as in cases where the race of the perpetrator is known, in about 53% of them they were indeed black. As for the claim that in 2015, 96% of homicides committed by blacks were against other blacks, I couldn't find any source that had that number. The closest statistic I found from a legitimate source was a report by the BJS which only included data on crime up to 2008 and stated that 93% of black victims were killed by blacks. The closest number to what Elder actually said is from that one time Donald Trump tweeted fake statistics about crime. So, did Elder slightly misremember that fake number and accidentally made up a new fake statistic? Maybe. I can't say for sure that this is the number he was thinking of when he said that, but ultimately the point is that he's full of shit. Looking at actual statistics from 2015 by the FBI, we find that in about 89% of cases where the perpetrator was black, the victim was also black. You might also notice that in the majority of cases where the perpetrator was white, the victim was also white. 81% of cases to be exact. Indeed, most crime is intraracial. This is likely due to a variety of reasons, but two of the biggest contributing factors are the fact that, in most cases, the victim and perpetrator know each other. Plus, while Jim Crow laws might no longer be in effect, the US is still very much segregated. When we take into consideration the fact that most crime is intraracial, I think it becomes clear why Elder chose to focus on black crime while not mentioning white-on-white crime. He's not actually interested in how he can reduce the number of crimes committed against black people. He simply wants to dismiss the problem of police brutality and paint African Americans as violent in nature. A clear case of whataboutism. This claim that BLM supporters should focus more on black crime is something that you'll often hear as a retort to the idea that police violence is a problem. Of course, this is quite simply a naive misrepresentation of the nature of crime and the BLM movement, as from the very beginning its focus has been on police violence against African Americans, and obviously not every movement needs to focus on every issue at the same time. Regardless, I have to wonder on what exactly Elder is basing this claim that BLM advocates don't care about crimes committed against black people. I mean, sure, there's a Black Lives Matter website which, as far as I know, doesn't say anything about black-on-black crime like he wants, but the BLM movement is ultimately decentralized, so regardless of what this website or other organizations centered around BLM might say, you'd have to poll supporters of BLM to truly understand what they think. And while I can't necessarily tell you what every other BLM supporter believes, I can tell you some issues that I care about. Yes, I do care about crimes committed by and against black persons, and I also care about the fact that childhood poverty, education, parental death, and exposure to violence are all linked to crime and violent behavior. I also care about the fact that black children and adolescents are more likely to be affected by all of these problems. Now again, I can't necessarily tell you what every other BLM supporter believes, but I'm going to make an educated guess here. In the same way that BLM supporters care about the fact that African Americans are disproportionately affected by police violence, most of us will also care about other systemic adversities that African Americans face that influence crime rates. We want to address the issues that will actually help reduce crime in the black community, not just fit into racist rhetoric and vaguely wag our fingers by telling people that they should complain more about black-on-black crime. But recognizing systemic problems that disproportionately affect African Americans is part of the PC neoliberal cultural Marxist postmodernist cancel culture agenda, TMCR. So Larry is definitely not going to do that. So I guess that instead of recognizing systemic racism, the other option would be to tell black kids to pull themselves up by their glowing sneakers? Now, I'm not gonna go through the whole video because we've barely watched 5 minutes and this response is already long enough. But I'd like to talk about 2 more things that Elder says in the following clips.
And that, at the same time, I hear you laying out a pretty solid case.
These are just the facts. I'll tell you something else too. There was just a study, University of Washington. And it turns out cops were more reluctant, more hesitant to pull the trigger against a black suspect than a white suspect, probably because of the fear of being accused of racially profiling and the fear that the civil rights establishment was going to come down on them. So if anything, whites are more likely to be shot by a cop under certain circumstances than a black person. And in the last 30 or 40 years, the percentage of suspects killed by cops who are black has declined 75%. However, the percentage of whites killed by cops has flatlined.
Yeah.
And so if anything, people are more concerned about shooting black people for fear that they're going to be called racist.
This is the study that Elder mentions. In it, the researchers included both an implicit association test and simulations using videos and fake guns to assess how racial bias might affect police officers' response time and decision to shoot. As they state, this is an improvement on previous studies which simply used still images and simple shoot versus don't shoot buttons. They found that in the implicit association test, almost all officers had a clear bias against black people, and were far more likely to associate black faces with weapons. In contrast, in the simulations they found that cops were slower to shoot armed black suspects and more likely to incorrectly shoot unarmed white suspects. These results would indeed suggest that cops are more biased against white persons, but there are quite a few problems with this study. For starters, only 80 officers participated in the study, and they all came from a single police department. And if we look at the attrition rate, we see that a large portion of them didn't actually complete all experiments. With such a limited sample size, the generalizability of the study is questionable at best. Plus, as mentioned earlier, this was an experiment with fictional scenarios. Whatever the results, ultimately analyzing actual data from police shootings is going to give us a more accurate estimate of whatever bias police might have. When we do look at actual data on police killings, like the Washington Post article that Elder mentions, we do see racial disparities in the treatment of black and whites. Other studies using larger datasets also find racial disparities in police killings. And while the study Elder mentions does cite papers stating that they found results that contradicted the idea of anti-black bias, they've been criticized by other scholars on the grounds that these studies do show an overrepresentation of blacks in police shootings, and that some of the studies cited are of questionable quality. For example, the first source they mention is this report by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it only talks about justifiable homicides, not killings of unarmed civilians. You know, the ones that would actually indicate bias or lack thereof. And it outright contradicts one of their claims by stating that, quote, "There is little correspondence between trends in arrests for violent crimes and trends in justifiable homicides by police. The correlation is plus 0.2 for whites and minus 0.2 for blacks." So not only is the correlation between arrests and justified police shootings small, it's actually negative for African Americans. Some of the other sources I mentioned earlier also contradict the idea that police violence is affected by crime rates. The second study they cite here also doesn't help their case. It does initially state that there is a relationship between violence rates and police shootings, but it does so on very shaky grounds. And then later he states that the data from this study doesn't actually support that assertion. However, the most glaring problem is that this study also contradicts the idea of a reverse racism in police shootings. On tables 4 and 5, they show that black persons were far more likely to be injured or killed, and also more likely to have been unarmed and not assaulting an officer. Their dataset is small, so it's not really generalizable to the entire US, but again, it contradicts the narrative that the reverse racism paper is trying to push, and the authors don't even mention that. I'm not going to go through every single study they cited because that would take forever, but I do recommend you take a look at the critique I mentioned earlier, as they talk about various other problems with the study Elder points to. As with everything else, there will be a link in the description. Ultimately, the point is that Elder picked a study that's hardly useful for a variety of reasons, so the assertion that cops might actually disproportionately shoot whites doesn't hold up. Finally, there's the argument that the number of black persons killed by police has gone down while the number of white persons has remained the same. Now, there isn't much reliable data for the time span of 3 to 4 decades that Elder mentions, so the best we can use is data by the FBI, which, as mentioned earlier, isn't very reliable. Nonetheless, this data does show that the proportion of black persons being killed by police went down in that period. Elder seems to suggest that this means people only care about reducing police violence against black persons, while no one cares about the lives of white people. This argument only really holds up if, like Elder, you believe there are no racial disparities in police violence, which, as I've hopefully made clear, yes, there are. This decrease in the proportion of black people being killed isn't because people only care about black lives, it's because white lives have always mattered. And as racism slowly but surely erodes, black lives are starting to matter too. The final point I'm gonna make is that all of what I just said is based on reports by the police, which is a problem because we know that they lie in reports about use of force. George Floyd, Martin Gugino, Rikia Young. These are all cases of police lying to get away with excessive use of force, and in which footage later contradicted what they said. And it's more than just a few rare bad apples. According to Philip Stinson, a criminologist and professor of criminal justice, out of the more than 10,000 officer arrest cases he studied, about 6.3% involved false reports or statements, and about a quarter of those involved alleged acts of police violence. And when we consider that only a small percentage of complaints against police result in disciplinary action, and that even when they kill someone, only a minority of police officers even face charges, I think it becomes clear that, like Stinson says, the problem is likely more common than the data suggests. Oh, and also, complaints made by white persons were more likely to be taken seriously, so there's that. So yeah, that's it for this video. TLDR, Larry Elder is a lying idiot and systemic racism still exists, so good job California for not voting for him, I guess. In my next video I'll probably be debunking some BS claims that Benjamin Chaperoldus III made about trans people, so if you feel like watching that, consider subscribing. See ya!